I wanted to introduce our guest speaker for today, Mr. Tim Shiel, who has a very wide-ranging music industry experience, starting as a music producer, a music writer with his project Faux Pas, probably 2004, around that time, and then moving on to work with Wally de Becker, aka Gautier, and working on the Gautier's world tour as a member of Gautier's band. Also running a record label, Spirit Level, and a podcast under the same name. And also being a self-managed artist. And on top of that, also providing music for computer games. I might have missed something because there's quite a range of activities that you are involved in, but hopefully that sets the stage for us for the discussion and any questions that you might have for Tim. So without further ado, please welcome Tim Shiel.
Thank you. Hello.
And Tim, before you start, if anyone wants to ask a question, stick your hand up, and before, ahead of time, we'll get a microphone to you. There's one mic on that side. Sorry, what's your name?
John.
John's got a mic on that side. So if we have a couple of hands up for first bunches of questions. We're starting with questions, are we?
Yeah. So
okay.
Essentially the whole thing will be a Q&A, one big Q&A. So I'll be asking questions, Tim will be asking questions, and hopefully you will have questions as we go.
I'm going to start off. Tim, can you talk about how you balance all the various projects that you work on, whether you find it's best to have a portfolio of different projects that you work on for multiple income streams, or whether it's best to focus wholly on a particular thing at any given time?
I think that really depends on who you are. Like I think I realised pretty quickly. Do you want me, I can move this too, by the way, if that helps. I'm all good. I think I've always been drawn to multitasking and juggling lots of different things. So I've had the various music pursuits. I do a radio show. I've worked in radio for 7 or 8 years as sort of a parallel thing.
I forgot to mention radio, of course, yes.
And then, thanks a lot. And then alongside that, I've had different day jobs and stuff in the past too. In the past, over the past 10 years, it's probably only been like the last 3 or 4 years where I haven't had a day job. So in terms of juggling versus focus, I've definitely asked myself the same question a lot in the last couple of years. You know, I've kind of had some wins and some good luck in all these different career paths that are kind of running in parallel for me. And I have kind of found myself wondering, you know, when is it time to start like trimming the branches of the tree, essentially? It sounds lame, but I think of my work life as this tree and all of these different branches going out in different directions. And they're kind of related, like working as a curator of music essentially for radio it's in the same ballpark as running a record label and A&Ring a record label, and that's in the same ballpark as writing my own music and making music for games. They're all part of the same world. It's music, right? But I have found myself thinking, if I just focused on one thing, could I kind of, get further or whatever that even means? And I still don't really know the answer to that. I think I've just realised that it's like, it helps me and it works for me to juggle lots of things because that's my personality type. I have a short attention span. I like multitasking. And nothing has really emerged yet as being the thing that I should just do. But it definitely works better for some people to just focus on one goal. I mean, we talked a bit about this on Monday, but I think for me, focusing in on one goal, if I'd woken up, 10 years ago and gone, I'm just going to aim to be a radio presenter. I want to have a media career in Australia. I'm going to not write music. I'm going to not...
If that helps.
Hey?
You can look at us.
Yeah, I'm just, trying to see the peeps.
It's hard with the light.
I mean, I could have woken up and gone, I want to have a media career in Australia. I want to be Richard Wilkins, right? What do I need to do in order to become Richard Wilkins? And that is a pathway, that's potentially a pathway for me. But if I'd put all my eggs in that basket, then I probably wouldn't have had all these other opportunities come along, like touring with Gautier or working in games. So for me, it's worked to juggle, but it's really about what skills you have and what kind of personality you have as well.
But you mentioned also that you've been lucky and things have gone your way, but the sense that I'm getting is that you've actually just been working really hard and you've been incredibly dedicated and focused at doing the best job that you can on any of the projects that you're working on. So, sure, you say that you're lucky and you get all this work coming your way, but you have earned it as well, haven't you?
Yeah, I do think that like the cliches around luck are really are correct. They're cliches for a reason. That idea that luck, you sort of generate luck or you earn luck by working really hard. And I have worked hard. I mean, I think I obviously am drawn to music for some reason, and probably like everyone in this room, you know, that was at a earlier age. For me, it was in my teenage years, just kind of realising like, oh, there's something here. There's something in music. I connect to it. I have an affinity for it. So maybe this is something I can work in or I can exist in for a long period of time. You know, so there is an element of, there must be some talent or skill there, because that's why I said to myself, this is what I want to do. But yeah, it is. I think luck happens when you put yourself in a position where great opportunities can come up. So all these opportunities I've had, most of them have kind of, in some ways, they've felt like they've come out of nowhere. But then when I stop and think about it, I actually think, well, actually, all of this other work I've been doing over here has put me in a place where I've had the skills and maybe the relationships to have this opportunity appear from over here. And I guess that's another argument for multitasking, diversifying your skills.
Could you talk a little bit about your collaborations and how you collaborate with people and how you develop those relationships across different projects?
Well, I guess it's really different, you know. It really depends on the project. I think probably for me, the one thing I've realised about myself, and this may be true for most people, is, and again, it sounds obvious, but when you're collaborating, you just have to you have to get along with the person that you're collaborating with. You have to be able to communicate really openly. Some people don't have that necessarily as a skill. They're not great communicators, and that makes them not great collaborators. The key to collaborating is being able to talk to each other openly and have a communal kind of language. And even if you don't necessarily see eye to eye, being able to find a pathway where you can talk to each other about that. I think, you know, I can give you two examples of a really easy collaboration and then a collaboration that wasn't as easy but still worked out great. So the label that I run, called Spirit Level, our sort of primary artist at the moment is a Melbourne guy called Brailleface. And we release his music, but I'm also his manager. And so we're communicating every day about what he's doing with his music and plans and promotion. He's on Triple R right now doing an interview, which is good. I was just tweeting about it before jumping on here. And yeah, I was drawn to him because we have similar musical vocabulary. I discovered his music and I was so drawn to it, like on this really intuitive level. Like I just heard it and I thought, I know what this is. I know how to help this. Like I know how to help this music become a better version of what it already is. So I think I might work with this guy. And then I met with him and we just got along as friends instantly, and we have become really solid friends. So that was an example of the two of us just kind of going, whoop, and it just both of us knew just really naturally that it was going to work. And now I help kind of mix and produce his music, and I help with all facets of his career, and we just have this level of communication that it's like friends. It's like really great friends where you're sort of finishing each other's sentences and you're already thinking the same things and all of that kind of stuff. So that's an example of just like, when you have an intuition about a potential collaborator, a lot of it just comes from, can I understand this person on some fundamental level? Are we similar or are we? The other example is I worked on a film soundtrack a couple of years ago. My first and only film soundtrack with a couple of Melbourne producer-directors who made a documentary about independent gaming. So they basically travelled around the world filming interviews with different game developers and then cut it together into this really, really amazing film, which is all about this movement of indie gaming in the world. And the film's called Game Loading, and it was great. It was a really great experience for me. I ended up writing something like 60 or 70 minutes of music for the film, which they peppered throughout, and we were in close collaboration constantly. They would send me edits of scenes and give me feedback on, you know, can you... But where the communication was difficult for us was we got along as friends, and we knew that, you know, we liked working together, but they didn't really have a musical vocabulary. They're very much film-based, and they could say things like, this doesn't feel right, or they could say things like, we want this to have energy, but they couldn't get to the point of saying, we need this to be extended by 2 bars, or like, you know, we need this to feel like... The vocabulary that they used to describe music was quite difficult for me to interpret. I think that's what I'm trying to say. So we had a bit of difficulty just getting past that, and that just took a bit of time, almost just on a basic level, understanding how each other hears music and experiences music and what words we use to describe it. Sometimes you have to go back to that level, go through some of that stuff, and then you've got this shared vocabulary that you can collaborate from.
So the common language that is established is important to be able to work across gaming, film, sound, all those elements.
I think so, but it also depends on the nature of the collaboration. You know, like I'm trying to work on projects constantly that are really creative and really, you know, and have deep collaboration with my collaborators. It's not maybe as necessary if the collaboration is a bit more surface, if it's more like, I don't know. If the stakes aren't as high, I guess, collaboration doesn't have to be so intense or so kind of, I don't know, emotionally bedrocky. But for the kind of projects I want to work on, those are the kind of collaborations I want to have, where it really feels like you've intertwined very closely.
And would you also have projects where you don't collaborate, where you work primarily on your own thing, where you are driving most of the project on your own? Or would you say that a collaborative approach is pretty much the majority of the work that you do?
I think I'm less interested in working on my own now, because I did do that for the first sort of 5 or 6 years of my own music career, which is music career. It's basically I was putting out EPs and albums on Bandcamp and selling CDs through my website. You know, wasn't really a music career, but I was putting music out and trying to be part of the music community in Melbourne. But I didn't have anyone on my team, like I didn't have a manager or a label, or I didn't work with publicists. I got to know some media because I'd started doing some work at Triple R, and I was always really proactive in pitching my music to radio and online, so I kind of got to know the industry a little bit. But I always worked as my own little bubble. And in some ways, I still do that. It's just that I've kind of expanded the bubble to let other people in it. So the label is an example of that, where it's, you know, we talk about the label being an artist-run community, which sounds great, but what that actually means is it's a family of artists and I run it. That's what that means. But that works really well for Spirit Level.
Is it just you running the label, or do you have anyone else helping with any other promotional or managerial or A&R duties?
It's just me at the moment. We have an interesting structure in that the co-director of the label is Wally from Gautier. So we started the label up in order to license an American band's record from the States and release it in Australia a couple of years ago. And at that point, we were both heavily invested in it. And we were really just trying to find an Australian audience for this American band that we toured with, that we really loved. And then Wally moved to New York, and since he moved, he's kind of become the guardian angel for the label that sits on high, and every now and then I ask him dumb questions and over Skype, and most of the time I'm just running around doing the label on my own. We have, just in the last 6 months, have started to kind of bring in, I guess, interns, or just a handful of people who are really enthusiastic and are maybe just looking to learn. And that's been a good experience, and just trying to help people focus on the things that they are interested in terms of maybe having a career in music one day, and then finding tasks for them to do around the label. But that's been good and also challenging, because it can be really hard for me to delegate.
To direct tasks. Yeah. But in terms of what an intern can do, that might be of interest perhaps, what kind of tasks would you delegate to a person working as an intern for a label?
That's been the tough question for me, you know, because I know there's other labels in Melbourne who are maybe in some ways similar to Spirit Level in terms of how they operate, who do have intern programs relatively well established. I've struggled to figure out exactly what interns can do. I know that there's tasks that I do for the label that I'd rather someone else do. Things like media servicing, sort of low-level publicity. maintaining a list of local media contacts, and which is basically maintaining a spreadsheet and regularly checking websites to make sure that the same journalists are still working at the same publications and the same presenters are on the same slots on radio stations, and then building relationships with them over time. That's something that I have experimented with getting interns to help with. And also we've just started putting on live events, and that's the place where having all hands on deck is really helpful on the day and also in the lead up to it as well.
And in terms of your artists, because you mentioned an example where you became good friends with one of the key artists on the label, would you describe your A&R process as primarily driven by personal connections, or do you also work with people who submit demos and you just like the demo and you would say, yes, I would like to work with you even if you are on a different continent? Would that be the case as well, or not so much?
The label's so new that I would hesitate to say this is the way I do it. I think I'm in a unique position because of my radio show. I am spending a big chunk of every week looking up music and just scouring the internet for new music, new Australian artists and also international stuff. That's part of my day job. That is my day job now, essentially. Is I work at the ABC. I work for Triple J and Double J. I do their electronic music show, and so that means that I have a part of my week which is, and I'm not saying I use that time for A&R for the label, but because my tastes are sort of overlap with my role at the station, it means that I'm already in that space where every week I'm trying to stay on top of what's emerging and what's new.
So you get to be a tastemaker.
I am also a tastemaker. I'm an influencer. I prefer the term influencer. Yeah. Curator, tastemaker, and influencer are three words that should probably be banned, but I've probably already described myself as all of them in the last 10 minutes.
But the way that you have essentially landed that Double J job is from large amounts of time at PBS and Triple R?
At Triple R.
Triple R particularly?
Yeah.
So volunteered for shows and presented shows yourself and be part of that community?
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I got my start at Triple R in 2007, I think. I did a graveyard shift with a friend who had already been doing graveyards there, and we did a shift together, and the station heard it and they really liked it, and they happened to have a slot open on the grid. So they offered us a midnight on Tuesday, I think, slot maybe.
Time slot.
Yeah, time slot. Yeah, and we did that for a few years, covering, I guess, electronic music and learning how to do radio together a little bit at the same time. I think it was luck combined with some hard work. And then I spent a year on the breakfast program on Triple R, which is a paid position. The breakfast team on Triple R, they're the only presenters that get paid. You get paid a really small stipend, so it's not, you end up working a full-time job and you get paid not even nearly a full-time wage, but the small stipend's like an indicator of the importance of that role at the station and just how much work actually goes into it. And it's super disruptive. Doing breakfast radio I think it was more disruptive on my life than having 2 children, which is pretty huge. But yeah, so I think in terms of when Double J came around, and I assume that this was kind of the process for them. They kind of figured out what kind of portfolio of presenters they wanted to cover a wide range of music, and they had a slot free for someone who would do something like what I would do and approach me. And at the time I was just, I had to go for it.
So for independent musicians, from my view that PBS and Triple R are the greatest supporters of independent musicians in Melbourne and Australia, and it seems to be quite unique around the world to have community radio stations that are that invested and that supportive. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that Triple R has played in your life in terms of developing an audience, developing community, developing an industry that you work in.
Absolutely. It just can't be overstated. You know, Triple R and PBS and SYN and 3CR, but it's particularly Triple R and PBS. They effectively are the hubs in Melbourne for independent music in a very real way, not just in terms of the music that they play on air and the support they give to artists, playing music to what is a really big audience in Melbourne. I think in some parts of inner Melbourne, Triple R outrates Triple J, I think, you know. That's the anecdotal word. You can just see it by if you just drive around. You see those Triple R bumper stickers on it. I mean, everyone here probably listens to Triple R and PBS. They're just these iconic, super influential stations. And if some of the presenters start to play music, then people will hear it. So it's a great first step for any artist. But even the thing that I think makes Triple R and PBS really important that sometimes people don't think about is they're really important physical hubs for the music industry, because you have artists, managers, publicists, venue bookers constantly going in and out of those doors for interviews, for live performances, to meet with people at Triple R. A lot of the people who work at Triple R or are presenters at Triple R are also artists or managers or venue bookers. And so in a very real way, you have basically Melbourne's independent music community just bumping up against each other constantly all day, every day. And that's kind of, you kind of can't overstate that. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't have Melbourne's music scene, which is world class, like in terms of independent music cities. I think they've just announced that Melbourne is going to be like international music city or something for 2018, which is huge. And you travel around a bit to other cities and realise, because we're so isolated in Australia, and Melbourne is isolated, and Australia is really small, like as a country, but Melbourne is just, there are very few cities that are as diverse and vibrant with music as Melbourne.
So given that Australia is geographically isolated, you've obviously travelled the world playing with Gautier and seen a lot of other scenes, but you're still based in Melbourne. Any other scenes that have advantages over what we have here, or where would you rather live in the world?
I have that conversation a lot. It's tricky for me. I'm not in a point in my life where I can easily move because I've got 2 young kids, so I can't really uproot my family, unfortunately. It's something you can maybe get away with in your 20s. I'm in a position where I could only really relocate if I landed upon some opportunity which, financially allowed me to move my whole family and then support them. But in terms of scenes, I mean, you can't really say. It's so impossible to say because every city has its own unique character and its own unique flavour. I think for me, if I was going to, then LA or New York would be the ones, or London or Berlin. I mean, they're traditional music hubs, all for different reasons. Berlin has long history of electronic music and still has a super vibrant electronic music scene. If you ever think of Melbourne as having like this default rock history, like if you think of the 70s, 80s, 90s of Melbourne's pubs, it's pub rock, it's indie rock, it's like Nick Cave is like god of Melbourne, and Berlin is like that, except it's like techno. You just imagine like techno has been king for 30 years, so that would be amazing. London is like the hub of music for all of Europe, so it's super competitive but super vibrant, obviously. LA is where you would go if you want to break into pop, kind of commercial pop songwriting, or into film or something, because it still is the case that Hollywood is where a lot of that stuff happens. And New York, I guess, is just that's the X factor. I mean, everything happens in New York. But I think the other thing that's worth noting is like there's so much you can do from Melbourne. Like it's never really been easier than now to have an international presence while being based in anywhere in the world because of the internet. So it's kind of a bit of the wrong approach to think, things will happen once I move overseas. You can kind of make things happen as soon as you want just by making good music.
It's an interesting proposition, and yeah. I just wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to the internet-oriented side of things, which was obviously a big part, and still is a big part of what you are doing as a label promoter, for example. But I know you're running a podcast, and I just wanted to ask you whether that podcast is just another avenue for you to express your thoughts about various creative aspects of the music industry, or whether there is a more of a promotional angle to the podcasting, So maybe if you could explain how it all started for you with the podcast and what are the objectives for you of being involved on that level?
Yeah, well, the podcast has been quiet for a few months, but it's just started up again. The podcast is basically I just jump on a microphone and talk about what's going on with Spirit Level, the label, and I'll talk for 15, 20 minutes, talk about what I've been doing that week, what I'm thinking about, and inevitably I always end up veering off into some kind of self-help pep talk. You can do it, because I've been listening to too many of those kind of entrepreneurial podcasts that are all like that. So, but why did I start it? I guess there's a couple of reasons. Like one is I do really want to be open and sort of inclusive, and I know that it can really frustrate people who are starting out in music. Even though it's never been easier to access information, it can still frustrate musicians not knowing what they're meant to be doing or what they should do or, what's the next step. If anything, like the amount of different information and the amount of diverse pathways towards a career or towards whatever it is you're aiming for, that's all become so complicated that it can be a bit overwhelming. So I thought I'd add to that by just throwing another podcast in the mix, I guess. Now that I've said that out loud, I think maybe I shouldn't be doing the podcast because it's confusing. But my point is I like the idea of opening the door a bit and going, hey, this is what I'm doing this week. Like I went and had a chat with this publisher to talk about potentially a publishing deal. What is a publishing deal? Well, I sort of understand it. Let me talk it through it for 5 minutes or so. If I had had that podcast 10 years ago, it would have been really valuable for me. So, there's that. There's also the fact that I have worked in radio for a long time, so it's a bit of a no-brainer for me to do some sort of radio show type thing around Spirit Level because I sort of have the skills for that. And then I do like the idea of building a community, a really tight-knit community around the podcast. So we have a very small listenership to the podcast. We have about 100 listeners, like 100 subscribers who will listen to every single episode.
Does that reflect the difficulties of disseminating podcasts, do you think? Is it just purely that people don't listen to podcasts much anymore? Would you think that's part of the problem, or...?
I think the listenership of podcasts has exploded in the last couple of years and is still growing. But the actual technological platform for discovering and distributing podcasts is still really primitive. So it is true that it can be quite hard to find podcasts. So when I say we have 100 listeners, they would all be people who are following the label. I don't think anyone's accidentally finding the podcast while flicking through the iTunes store or whatever, because that's not really a thing that exists with podcasts much. But I guess I haven't really actively promoted the podcast either, because for me, it's not about reaching 10,000 listeners who are all listening to the podcast and skimming through it or whatever. I'm actually a bit more excited about 100 people who are hanging on every episode and highly invested. And, those are the people that will come to our shows. Those are the people that will listen to they'll stream our music, they'll follow our artists, they'll engage with our artists, and that's already what's happening. So the podcast is really a way the podcast isn't for a broad audience, it's for those super, super, super fans.
Is your attitude towards making music the same? For less of an audience, but really dedicated and, quality relationships with your audience and that they really understand what's going on and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think labels of the size of Spirit Level, and maybe slightly bigger, would answer this maybe all the same way. In that, I guess I want to work with artists who understand what it is they do and who they are and have a realistic perspective about that. I can kind of help with that sometimes in terms of saying to an artist, you make ambient drone music, right? That has an audience, but it's this audience. It's not this audience, it's this audience. And that's really exciting, and I love your music. Let's work together to get your music in front of this audience. I do that because I love music that is a bit niche, and I want to exist to support those people. But I guess the flip side of it is I'm also trying to build a community and build essentially a business over the longer term. So for me, when I'm trying to find artists, I'm finding those really unique artists, but I'm trying to find the unique artists that can expand from that point without compromising who they are. So Brailleface is a good example of an artist who, if you listen to his music, it is niche. The sound of it is down a certain path, but he has this beautiful voice that rings out and he writes incredible songs. And so I have this feeling that he's an artist who's going to speak to a small group of people but has the potential to reach much more. And I'm never going to force him to become, you know, whatever that broader thing is. I just have a gut instinct for that. So, you know, that's where you sort of, A&Ring a label becomes a bit like gambling, where you're just thinking, I don't know. You want to help somebody become what it is what their vision for themselves is, which hopefully is in line with what your vision for them is.
Yeah, right. So there's an emphasis of quality rather than quantity in some respects, but I'm interested in also, you know, Melbourne's an expensive place to live. You know, you got to pay rent, you got your family, young kids. Obviously, there is pressure to, you know, do the mainstream thing and have, you know, regular, you know, income coming in so that you can be, you know, sustainable as a family, pay bills, all the rest of it. I just wonder how you balance the idea of trying to be really true to your values and perspectives and the art form, as opposed to just trying to pay the bills.
I guess I've worked a long time to get to the point where my day job that pays my bills, or day jobs, are music related, you know. So I get paid to work on music for games, and I get paid to do my radio work. I don't get paid to do the label, and I don't really get paid to pursue my own music. At the moment, those entities are breaking even. You know, it's essentially we invest money for the label. We invest money, we'd make that money back. Maybe we get a little bit of money that goes into the next thing that we do, and that will be the model for us indefinitely, unless something happens, unless something breaks through or it grows in some way. Then that is the model, and that is the model for most indie labels and also for most artists. And I think part of being an artist is coming to terms with that. The sooner you kind of realise, oh, it's not like I have a day job for a bit and then I'm going to be a full-time musician. Like, you have a day job forever. That's actually the reality for 99% of musicians. And it can sound pretty harsh, and it's not a reflection of whether your music's any good. It's just the reality. So I think the sooner you kind of get your head around that, it kind of helps you realign all of your goals a little bit. So maybe you figure out that work-life balance. Maybe you find a job that is either related to music or your creative pursuits, or maybe you find a job that's got nothing to do with it, but it's really low cost in terms of your investment of energy and time, that allows you the space to pursue musical or creative projects without the pressure of it being your job. Because a lot of artists crumble once they get to that point where they've got a taste of it, they've got a hint of like, oh, I think music's it could be my job. Like, all this stuff's lining up. That's often when artists implode, because they can't figure out that tricky pathway of how do I keep building this? How do I keep appeasing my imaginary audience? Or things get really complicated at that point. So it's one of my things that sometimes people don't want to hear it, but the sooner you realise, like, the sooner you kind of come to terms with it, the more free you are to actually pursue your creative pursuits, I think.
I think there's a question.
Yeah, sort of just as a segue to what Tim asked, like, financial stability is obviously an important consideration, but also I guess I've got a couple of tangents to that in terms of what tools do you use to basically manage how thin you spread yourself to maintain the quality of your work across everything that you're doing, but also maintain, I guess, your sanity and also working on things for yourself as well?
Well, short answer is I don't. So sometimes it's all going great and I'm juggling everything and I'm feeling really good about it. And then sometimes I just fall in a heap because I've overloaded myself, or, you know, because too many deadlines have all appeared all at once in the same week. That's the hard part. And I don't really like to bitch and moan about it because I love everything I do, and I also brought it on myself to pursue all these different things at once. But that is the hard part. The hard part is time management and then stress and pressure. And it's also, so a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the projects that I'm involved in, they're also self-directed. And it would be the same it's the same for a lot of people involved in music. You're constantly, like, you're your own boss, essentially. And that means that you, in order to move forward, you often have to put a lot of pressure on yourself. So it's something that I often have to deal with is just that internal pressure. I may not even necessarily be working with collaborators who are on my back about get this done, get that done. All the artists I work with for the label are all really understanding and lovely. None of them are ever calling me up going, where's this? Why isn't this happening? You said this would happen and it didn't. Like, they're all really sweet. That's why I'm working with them, is because they're all lovely people, but I put all that pressure on myself. So I've definitely had moments, particularly in the last couple of years, as things have escalated a bit for me, where I've really struggled with that. But in terms of tools that can help with that, I think, a big part of it's mental health. I think you can't really take all of that on unless you have a kind of a clarity of mind. And that's different for every person. Every person has their own kind of personal things that they're dealing with in their head. But finding ways to work through that stuff, if it is something that you are living with, you have to do that. The more you work, the more it can exacerbate some of those issues. I've had experience with that myself. And other tools is just like productivity tools. I really rely on things like Google Calendar and Gmail plugins that help me manage large volumes of email, and just getting better at being more efficient at tasks, which really just comes from doing things a lot. So, I'm more efficient now at music discovery for my radio show than I probably ever have been. Like, I can very quickly assess what music has come out in the week and listen to a lot of things in a short period of time because I've spent so much time doing it. And that also applies to something as mundane as answering emails. I can sit down to an inbox full of 100 emails that have flown in the last 24 hours and I can try and smash that out in a couple of hours because I've been doing it so long that I now can just go delete that, respond to that tomorrow. Okay, sounds good. Then it's just the doing. It's the doing of the work,
One interesting thing that you said on Monday was that you haven't been more productive since you've had kids, that you've actually been more productive since having kids, which I found was quite very interesting.
Yeah, I spent my 20s pretty low-key and pretty unproductive, and it was awesome. And I miss it. I miss sitting around in my undies and playing Xbox. It was awesome. I love doing that. It was great. So sometimes I catch myself thinking, man, I wish I'd worked as hard in my 20s as I am now. But then, I wouldn't be where I am now if I didn't have that chill out time in my life. But having kids, particularly if you're ambitious and you want to work hard, then the amount of time you have available to work just shrinks because I want to spend a lot of time with my kids. I don't want to be absent at all, really. So I think at the moment maybe I work about 30, 35 hours a week, and I'm probably doing things that someone else without kids would spend 80 to 100 hours a week doing, like proper entrepreneurial, burn the candle at both ends type stuff. And I'm just not doing that. I clock off every day at 5 o'clock so that I can go home and have dinner with my kids. And I start every day at 9, and I don't work on weekends. And I don't work on Mondays because I'm hanging out with my kids. So when we had our kids, that's what I wanted. So I have these windows of time. I have very specific work hours. So even though my work can be a bit nebulous and a bit like I'm doing this and doing that and what am I meant to be doing today, I have very clear hours for when I'm doing it. And I think, it all depends what stage you're at in your life and who you are and blah, blah, blah. But doing that earlier, I probably would have been a bit more productive, gotten further along a bit. If at some point in my 20s I'd just gone, screw it. I'm going to work on music from 9 till 5 every day. I've got my day job here, I've got a shift here and a shift there. And then outside of that 9 to 5, I'm always going to be writing music or learning about music. And, that...
But you approach it like a 9 to 5 job, in essence.
Oh, absolutely.
That you clock on, you clock off, and you don't have to be inspired to be able to create.
That's a big thing. Yeah. I really believe in the discipline of creativity. You get better at being creative by doing it. That's the way you get better. Not by waiting for inspiration, not by consuming more and more music, listening to more and more things that you love. That's part of the process. You know, inspiration and learning is part of the process, but you get better by doing. So, you know, if you've written 5 songs and you're trying to figure out which of those 5 songs might be a good song to lead with, if you're thinking about putting a song up on SoundCloud or something, the answer usually is you need to write 100 more songs, you know, like why stop at 5? So, you know, I know that I've got a folder on my computer that has hundreds and hundreds of bad ideas and demos and probably some good ideas as well. And some of them are made for a purpose and a lot of them aren't, but yeah, I mean, the creative process has to be, you have to work at it to get better.
I think it's probably a good time to mention also that you don't have a formal music education background, and here we are in a formal music education facility. But you clearly take a lot of inspiration and a lot of diverse influences from other areas of creative practice. Just wondered if you could talk about whether that has been a detriment or it has been an advantage to look at music through different perspectives.
I think working in games the last few years has been really interesting because so Melbourne, for those who don't know, Melbourne has a incredibly thriving and diverse independent game development scene. So there's a whole bunch of little tiny studios making great mobile games and independent Steam and console games based in Melbourne, and there's been some huge successes. Crossy Road being the maybe the big obvious one, but there's been a whole bunch of just huge games, $1 million games coming out of Melbourne.
So quite easy to know them in person and establish a conversation, I guess.
I've gotten to know a lot of those, like that scene, which has been really good. But I guess to answer your question, learning a bit more about the process by which those game studios develop their products and then research them and then market them has been really interesting because there are a lot of parallels between independently developing a game and then releasing it and independently developing and releasing a music release. There's a lot of parallels. They're both digital products. They're both created with some sort of user in mind at the end. They're both usually juggling creative and commercial goals. They're both usually artistic in some way, but then, you know, require some sort of marketing or strategy in order to reach people. And yeah, meeting game developers and seeing how that world works and what their approach has been really interesting. I think one thing I have taken out of working with gamers or game developers, and it's pretty basic, but game developers are constantly reiterating their games when they're in development by showing them to people. You know, that's a huge part of the development process for them is they'll have an idea and then they'll cobble together a build on an iPad or whatever that they can take out. I mean, I've got a friend who just walks out onto the street. I'll go down to Flinders Street with an iPad and just go, can you just play this game and see how you go? And he'll be taking notes, going, oh, they couldn't get past the second puzzle, or they seem to really, their face lit up when they saw this character. And but I think musicians sometimes don't do that, or there isn't necessarily an infrastructure in place for musicians to do that easily. Something like SoundCloud and some of those platforms, I think that's why they've been popular in some ways, because they have encouraged people to comment and like on each other's stuff and give each other encouragement and feedback. But sometimes I wonder, like game conventions, this is a good example. So indie game developers will take their games to a game convention before it's finished. So they'll set up a booth and they'll have all their branding and stuff, big posters. They have all these computers set up so people can come up and play the game. And it's not finished; it's halfway done, or they've only done one level. And they're doing that because they want that feedback. You know, they're also trying to get studios interested and get people that are going to be able to help promote the game interested. But that's a thing that never happens in music. You don't have a music festival where, like, you know, people rock up with their ideas half formed and show them around and. You know, I mean, maybe you sort of do. Maybe you look at something like Big Sound or Face the Music. You could argue that some of the bands that showcase at those events are kind of maybe not fully formed, but in reality, at those events, you know, the bands that are showcasing are a few steps down the track already in terms of figuring out what they do and who's in their team and blah blah blah. So it's interesting. There just isn't really that culture in music where, you know, you're sort of taking it to an audience before it's finished, and that doesn't happen so much in music.
The closest equivalent, I guess, would be playing your local shows and playing tracks that you are still fine-tuning.
Workshopping your tracks in that way, yeah.
But you're right, and I think, what you're pointing out too is very good observation about how music can be a very solitary process, and when you are in your own bubble,
Yeah.
with not much external input.
Like, it also speaks to the difference between being artistically motivated and being commercially motivated, for want of a better term. You know, I guess the studios I do work with and the game developers I'm drawn to, they're making artistic products, but they also want people to enjoy them. So when they're making their games, there's a functional part of their way of assessing whether the game is going well is the person enjoying it? Are they having fun? And if that means their really cool artistic idea is going to have to go to the side because it's not fun or someone's not really going to enjoy it, then they're willing to make that kind of sacrifice. And there's plenty of game developers out there who are purely artistically motivated and they don't care about what the end result is because they have a vision. And there's obvious parallels with that in music, you know. There's almost, you can't really just say it's two different types of musicians, but in some ways it sort of is. You've got musicians who are just driven to be artistic, they're expressing something that's unique and special, and they either are not willing or don't even have the skills to compromise or rethink that. And then you've got other musicians who are thinking about the end result. You know, they're thinking, okay, how's this song actually going to land with someone? What are they going to feel? You know, what's it going to mean to them when it goes in their ears on a really functional level, you know? And they're two different skills. They're two different kinds of musicians, I think.
Hi. Sorry, I just want to take you back quite a few questions now.
Yeah.
Because you're uniquely positioned working with artists that look at niche markets and things like that. So what's your advice for someone with a niche musical set, or in kind of finding that market, finding that niche market?
Yeah.
What would you consider critical to that process, and what would be useful in trying to get your music to the people who actually want to hear it?
Yeah. There's sort of two different answers because niche can mean two different things. So if niche means you are like, your music fits in with a very particular kind of subculture, say you're making like, I don't know, ska. Say you're a ska band, you know, you don't hear, ska every now and then will bleed into other more mainstream elements, but essentially ska is ska. There's a ska scene. In some ways that makes it easier. It's on a local level, because usually it doesn't take long to figure out who the other ska bands are, who the ska venues and promoters are, ska labels. So I don't really know much about ska, to be honest, but it's just an example. So in some ways that makes it a bit easier. So it really just becomes about connecting to those people and having them become your peers. And then you'll find the audience that way, because the audience for, subcultural music are drawn to those things, or EDM or whatever. There's kind of a bit of a pathway. What can be more difficult is when you're niche because you can't really define what it is you do in the context of a subculture. I tend to work with artists who are like that, who they might have hallmarks of particular things, but the end result is a combination of those things that doesn't make sense on a black and white kind of, it is this type of music level. That's more of a challenge. But it's still the same principle, I think, on a local level, is you've got to seek out the people that you think, that you see yourself in. I know that's how I started when I was making music. So my first few releases were under the name Faux Pas. It was sort of this weird electronic music that didn't have an obvious place where it sat, but I guess I just intuitively started reaching out to other artists in Melbourne that I thought might be coming from the same place philosophically, if not musically, and started connecting with some of them and connecting with some labels and media who, maybe there wasn't a radio show on at that time who I could hear my music being played on, but I knew who the adventurous presenters were. I knew who the presenters on Triple R were that were up for it, up for something interesting. And so I guess thinking about it that way and realising maybe I can't send Richard Kingsmill my really weird song that's a cross between metal and Norwegian squee and a cappella music. Maybe you've got to start at a different level with that kind of stuff. I don't know. I think the other thing that's a bit more relevant a bit further along is just keeping in mind that, going back to what I said, there just isn't a big enough audience in Australia for music that is niche. There just isn't. So if you are really, really serious about it and you want to have a long-term sustainable career as an artist, the earlier you start thinking about an international audience, the better. And that can seem really daunting, and that's because it is. It is really daunting and really hard. But, band like Hiatus Coyote is a good example. You know, they're a fairly niche band. And Melbourne has a really great kind of neo-soul scene that Hiatus Coyote could have thrived in for a really long time. But they wouldn't be full-time musos if it wasn't for breaking into a more global scene that supports that kind of music. It just would never have, I think, probably just would never have happened. They would have always had day jobs. They would have always been, and happy probably. And they would have been well respected and beloved, but they've been able to take it to the next level, and that's only happened internationally because they've had that access to a wider audience. What is a narrow band of people in Australia? If you add up that narrow band around the whole world, that's bigger than, that's huge if you can access it. But that's the big question. That's the hard part. I'm trying to figure that out at the moment for my artists.
Any other questions from the audience?
So you mentioned earlier that you were doing like sound for game development.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how you got into that. Did you have like friends that were developers, or like just what's the story? How did you get into sound design for games?
Yeah, I think I was kind of in the right place at the right time again. I essentially watched this. I watched a documentary film about indie gaming, specifically about that scene, the independent world, and I watched it and I kind of saw myself in it somehow. The kind of people that were drawn to being indie game developers, which was a world I didn't know about. Maybe it was that kind of thing I was just talking about. I just saw myself in what they were doing. I sort of understood creatively what the ambitions were, and this, you know, I don't know. So I literally watched that one night, and then the next morning I jumped on my Facebook and I said, do I know anyone who knows any game developers? Because I had some vague idea that Melbourne had a game scene, but I wasn't really connected to it. And then just because I have done all these various things over the years, I happen to know a few people who were pretty connected in that scene, and they set me up with some meetings with developers who were in the middle of developing games and that were looking for musicians, and they put in a good word because they knew who I was and they knew my music from in the past. And I guess I kind of had a sense that I might fit in that world because I am pretty technically minded. Like, I'm not a programmer, but I understand the logic of programming. And my music is diverse and nerdy enough that it opens the door to working in games where a lot of game developers just love nerdy electronic music.
There's an independent games festival in Melbourne. I think it runs out of the State Library. I've been to it 1 year. It's really fantastic opportunity to go and learn about independent games development in Melbourne. And, you know, there's a bar and a social scene there, so you can go talk to people, take business cards, you know, bring your sound design, bring your music and connect with people. Yeah, it's called free. I think you're talking about free play maybe. Yes. Yeah, the free play, and there's a few events like that. There's like a weekly, is it weekly or might be monthly, but there's a group in Melbourne called the IGDA, the Independent Game Developers Association, and they have chapters all around the world. They have one in Melbourne. They catch up, I think, every month to share game ideas, and anyone is kind of welcome. They have a Facebook group as well, which you can kind of apply to be invited to, which I'm not sure if it's closed or if it's kind of semi-open or something, and that's basically just all the local devs sharing advice and showing their games in development. Even if you're not feeling confident, that can be a good way to just almost eavesdrop on the conversations that developers have, so you can start to learn like what's important to them and what their processes are. But then places like events like Free Play, and then most obviously PAX Australia, which happens in October, November. That's where all the indie developers from all around Australia all go to PAX Australia. They all set up booths, they exhibit the games they're working on, and between Free Play and PAX, if you go there and just start having conversations, if you start gelling with people and connecting with developers, you'll get somewhere. I short-circuited the process a little bit because I already knew a couple of people, basically. But then I went to Free Play, I went to PAX. That's how I have kind of gotten further into knowing how the scene works.
Another question. I'm sure there are some people interested in the gear that you use and the compositional process that you use. Why don't you tell us about that?
My question's probably my answer's probably pretty boring. I use Ableton. So, and I've always used Ableton because I started working with Ableton soon after it came out. Before that I was using a program called Sony Acid Pro, I was using Sony Acid Pro because I was really interested in sampling and specifically waveform cutting and pasting. That was the kind of music I was making at the time. I was really drawn to things like the Avalanches and DJ Shadow, and even though those guys were using samplers and turntables, I liked the approach, and I realised that you could do the same thing by cutting up bits of MP3s and WAV files. So Sony Acid Pro was the best program for it when I started because it was the only one where you could loop, which sounds ridiculous now. It was the only one where you could loop audio and like warp the pitch and time of audio. When Ableton came out, it kind of blew that out of the water because that's what Ableton was built on, was warping audio essentially and looping audio. So yeah, I mean, I use Ableton, but I try and keep my process really creative. And so I try and use as many different sound sources and instruments and collaborators as I can and keep things pretty open. But in terms of gear, I have a very minimal production setup. I have Ableton, I've got a Nord Stage 2 piano, which I don't really use as a piano, I just use it as a way of getting musical notes and playing things into the computer. I've got a Teenage Engineering OP1, which I use sometimes. It's good for games. But that's it. And I've got a handful of plugins that I go to all the time for mixing and production. They're not particularly creative, they're just really workmanlike. Yeah, that's all good.
Just a quick question on that note, because I've been discussing with our students the importance of delimiting your setup and having boundaries. So it sounds like you do have very firm boundaries with hardware and software. Would you advocate for that approach rather than using a million of plugins just because you can? Do you think that helps the creative process to have a small amount of go-to instruments?
Yeah. It depends what you're doing, I guess. It depends what your goals are. If you want to become a commercial musician making music for ads or something, then you probably do want to have a giant arsenal of sounds and things at your fingertips that you can draw on.
Not so much for developing your own.
Yeah, if you're developing your own
style.
sound or something. I guess for me, it's just like the creative process for me is super intuitive. It's all about intuition. So when I'm working on a piece of music, I'm just trying to keep myself interested, essentially. And when I started, that was really frustrating because I didn't know what I was doing. And so I'd spend hours on something and still think it was shit. And I'd just be like, what am I doing? This is pointless. And it's just, it takes months or years to get over that. But in my experience, you do get past that. You eventually get to the point where you've done it enough that you can sit down and very quickly be in that space where you're like, I'm into this. Which might sound crazy, but that's how I work now. I work really quickly, and if I've got time to create, then I will sit down and open up a session, and I won't even know where to start. But within 10 minutes, I'll be like, I'm feeling it, and I'll be in this mode that some people call flow, which is like almost like a trance-like state where you're not really thinking about what you're doing. You're just kind of doing it, and time doesn't mean anything anymore, and it's a really happy kind of place to be in. But you have to do it a lot in order to access that place really quickly. And so for me, I guess I'm not really interested in cycling through hundreds of presets or plugging in 20 different synthesizers to see what they all sound like. Or I've always hated that approach, and some people swear by it. One of my best mates, who is Wally from Gautier, that's how he works. He will spend 6 months trying to find the right synthesizer sound for something by flying to 5 different cities to audition 10 different synths through 10 different... we're very different in that way, right? Whereas for me, it's like, I'm not interested in the tools, I'm interested in the feeling and the result. And so you can give me anything and I'll just start making music with it, and then I'll feel really good about it. I'll be trying not to think like, oh, if only I had this other sound or that other sound, or that stuff's kind of boring to me. It also means I don't program a lot of synth patches. I don't like modular synthesis because I'm not interested in the tools. I don't want to make the tools, I want to make the music. So I just get the tools that are in front of me and put some stuff together until it feels really good. And that's what works for me. Different people have different approaches, I guess, and are drawn to different parts of the process. For me, I want to get to the result as quickly as possible. So I'll take whatever shortcut I can.
That's the feel, that's the key word.
And flow.
The flow, yeah.
The flow. Yeah. So if, just in a summarising kind of thing, if you were to put together a list of, you know, like a top 5 things to do as an independent musician, apart from either, you know, contribute or get involved or subscribe to PBS RRR, fill out your APRA forms. What would you recommend next for independent musicians?
Wow. I don't know. I think, I guess it's sort of just a summary of the things I've been saying, which is like, just work, write constantly. Just write. Constantly be writing. Try not to be self-critical. Like, being self-critical is a skill also that you need to learn, and that I took, you know, everyone has missteps with that process as well. It's being self-critical, by which I mean having the objectivity to listen to something you've done and assess its merit by whatever criteria, whether that's your own internal criteria or something external. That's a skill that takes time to go through that process and not be put off by it, not be destroyed by it, not to make bad decisions because of that process. But even that, it's just by doing it, only by doing the actual creative side of things. So, I mean, I don't know, like, all that stuff is important. Yep, like, register with APRA, spend time on your Facebook and get your SoundCloud page set up. All that kind of stuff's cool. But essentially, if you're an artist, if you want to create music, the most important thing you can do, and what you should be spending 95% of your time doing, is making music. Like, learning about music, making stuff, maybe sharing it with friends whose opinions you really trust, then going back, make more stuff. Like, that's the key. And that doesn't really stop. That's the other thing, especially now, you know, like, even the artists I work with on the label, we've got all these ambitious plans and ideas and stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm spending most of my time just telling them to go back and write more music. That's, you know, that's what I'm doing as a label. I'm trying to remove all the other stuff so they can just make music. So, I don't know, that's maybe a wishy-washy answer, but it's my vibe. It's the flow.
Okay, I think.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Do we have one final question from the room? If not, I think that was a very good summary of our discussion. So thank you very much, Tim, for all the pearls of wisdom. That was great. Thank you.
I'll stick around a bit too if anyone's got questions, and also
I'll try to get you some water.
yeah, come on, I'm sweating up here. But
It's very hot. Yeah.
and if anyone wants to reach out with, like, on email or Twitter or anything, I'm really easy to find on the internet too. So I'm always up for answering questions or giving ideas and advice. So if you've got other questions, just come find me.